She had never been late. For 42 years, Margaret Wilson visited her husband's grave every Friday at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Rain or shine. It was ritual. It was memory. It was the only place she still spoke his name aloud. But that morning was different. As the gates of the historic Savannah Cemetery creaked open and her black heels clicked over the cobblestones, Margaret noticed something that made her stop mid-step. Someone was already there. A teenage boy, maybe 16, maybe 17, knelt at the grave she thought belonged only to her. His back was hunched, his curls matted by dew, his hands trembling as they held a bundle of wildflowers. They were not store-bought, not arranged, just picked, humble and fresh. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing at Thomas's grave? She stepped forward cautiously, her bouquet of pristine lilies tight in her hand. They were Thomas's favorite. But in that moment they felt cold, distant, performed. The boy did not turn. He did not move. He just knelt, quiet and sorrowful, as if he were praying or mourning or both. When Margaret finally found her voice, it was sharp and formal, a tone honed through decades of boardrooms and banquets. "You're at the wrong grave," she said curtly. The boy turned slowly. His eyes were glassy. He blinked up at her as if he recognized the voice or maybe just the pain behind it. "He helped me," the boy whispered as if confessing a sin. Margaret's heart clenched. "Who?" "Red," he said. "That was what he told me to call him." Margaret's voice faltered. "Thomas?" The boy nodded. She blinked, taken aback. Her face twitched into an incredulous smile. "You must be mistaken. You did not know him." The boy held her gaze. He did not flinch. His eyes were not challenging, but they were unwavering, steady and heartbreakingly honest. "He was more than you think," he said softly. Then, without another word, he placed the wildflowers on the headstone, gentler than one would place glass, and walked away. Margaret did not move. Her own bouquet trembled in her hand. Her eyes followed the boy's retreating figure. A boy she had never seen before. A boy crying at her husband's grave. A boy who whispered something that would haunt her long after he was gone. That night Margaret could not sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her sprawling bedroom, painted in creams and golds, untouched by chaos, and felt a storm brewing in her chest. The boy's words echoed like a drumbeat. "He was more than you think." At 4:17 a.m. she rose. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked barefoot to the library, where her husband's scent still clung to the leather chair by the fireplace. Tobacco. Power. The room was a museum of his life, framed awards, signed letters, antique maps of their shared travels. A story curated for guests and donors and dignitaries. She opened a family photo album and turned the pages. Gala events, ski trips, winery tours, charity balls. Smiling. Always smiling. She had known him. Had she not? She had loved him. Surely? She had been his wife 42 years. She had managed their finances, arranged their vacations, stood beside him at every press conference and fundraiser. But now a crack had formed. Something was bleeding through. And that boy knew something she did not. 2 days passed. And Margaret returned to the cemetery. She did not know what she hoped for. Maybe she expected the boy to be there. Maybe she thought the universe owed her an answer. But the bench by the grave was empty. Only the wildflowers remained, drying now, curling at the edges. Still, she could not bring herself to remove them. They meant something. Even if she did not know what. That evening, as dusk settled and her heart grew restless, she made a call. "George," she said to the family attorney, "did Thomas ever make any anonymous donations?" "Not through the foundation, ma'am," came the pause-filled reply. "Nothing on record." But not everything left a record. And Margaret knew in her gut, in her bones, something was missing. 2 more mornings passed. Then, on a Thursday, a day she never visited, she went again. And there he was. Same hoodie. Same bench. Same silence. He saw her coming but did not rise. He just nodded slightly, acknowledging her without surprise. Margaret sat beside him. Not close. But not far. "I do not like unanswered questions," she said, voice tight. He closed his notebook gently. "Then ask me," he replied. She inhaled sharply, prepared for whatever he might say, or feared what he would not. "Who are you?" she asked. The boy met her gaze. No fear. No arrogance. Just a weight behind his eyes that seemed far too heavy for his age. "My name is Jamal," he said. "And your husband was the first white man who ever believed in me." That night, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap. She repeated the words in her mind over and over, as if trying to untangle a knot only her heart could feel. The first white man who ever believed in me. What did that mean? What had Thomas done? Why had he never said anything? She crossed the room and opened the closet. Hidden behind scarves and boxes of designer shoes was a small safe. One Thomas had never let her open. The code was their wedding date. It clicked open with a cold finality. Inside, old documents, letters, a few photographs. She scanned them quickly, looking for scandal. But found something quieter. Something deeper. A letter from a public school, thanking an anonymous donor for saving their tutoring program. A handwritten note from a student. Thank you for helping me stay in college. You did not know me, but you saved me. A pamphlet from a youth mentorship group. Thomas's name scrawled in the corner, not in bold print. Just ink. Margaret sank to the floor. He had done this. In secret. Without her. Without anyone. She clutched one letter to her chest, trembling. She had thrown charity balls for hospitals and orchestras, causes that could be framed and photographed. But this was not for praise. This was soul work. And she had never seen it. The house was silent that night, but not peacefully so. Margaret stood in the middle of her walk-in closet, the letter still pressed to her chest, as though it could stop her heart from breaking in real time. Her breath came shallow. Her reflection in the vanity mirror looked paler than she remembered. Her husband, Thomas Wilson, the man she had accompanied to red carpet events, introduced to foreign dignitaries, kissed on the cheek in front of cameras, had lived a life behind a veil. And she had never bothered to peek behind it. She walked down the corridor barefoot, past their ballroom, past the long hallway of oil paintings, each one documenting legacy and lineage, and descended the marble stairs with heavy, uncertain steps. She needed answers. But not the kind found in spreadsheets or stock portfolios. The following morning, Margaret dressed plainly for the first time in decades. No designer trench coat, no silk scarf, no heels. She tied her silver hair into a low braid and slipped on comfortable flats. She did not call her driver. She drove herself. The address, scribbled on a folded slip of paper she had found tucked beneath the letters, read, Brookview Center, Room 3B. It meant nothing to her. Yet everything about it pulled her forward. The drive was unfamiliar. She passed through neighborhoods she had never stepped foot in, cracked sidewalks, graffiti murals, corner stores with faded awnings. The kind of place she used to lock her car doors while passing through. Thomas had come here. Often, apparently. What? Brookview Center was a modest, aging community building. A wooden sign with peeling paint welcomed her to the youth center. The smell inside was warm. Paper. Crayons. Old carpets. Childhood. A young receptionist looked up from the desk. Can I help you? She asked politely. Margaret unfolded the paper. Her voice caught in her throat before she forced it out. I'm looking for room 3B. My husband, Thomas Wilson, used to come here. I believe he... The receptionist's expression shifted. Oh, she said softly. Mr. Wilson. Yes, he was one of our best mentors. Every Tuesday, rain or shine. Margaret blinked. Mentor? She echoed. The woman smiled. Reading, writing, poetry. Some of the boys would wait by the doors an hour early just to be the first ones in. He said he wanted to give them what no one ever gave him. Margaret's knees felt unsteady. Thomas. Teaching poetry. Room 3B was at the end of the hallway. The door was cracked open. She pushed it gently. Inside was not a classroom, it was a sanctuary. Hand-drawn posters. Book quotes. Paper flowers strung across the ceiling. A bulletin board covered in photos of young boys smiling, arms slung around each other, around Thomas. One of them was Jamal. Scribbled on the wall in colorful markers. Believe in me before the world condemns me. My mentor, my mirror. She stared at the photos, her throat tightening. Then behind her, a voice said gently, I knew you'd come. She turned. Jamal stood in the doorway, his notebook under one arm, his hoodie damp from the weather. But his eyes, steady and deep, had the weight of someone older than his years. He used to say you'd find out one day, Jamal said softly. He just didn't know how or when. Margaret swallowed. Why didn't he tell me? Jamal looked around the room. Maybe he thought you wouldn't understand. The words hit harder than she expected. Maybe because they were true. She stepped into the hallway again, slower this time, her hand brushing the worn walls. Jamal walked beside her. The sound of children laughing echoed faintly from the floor below. It felt like another universe from the ballroom she had danced in only months ago. Margaret stopped by the front doors. He came here every week? She asked. Every Tuesday, Jamal nodded. Even when he was sick. Even in the rain. She turned to him, her voice softer than before. Why didn't he ever talk about it? He didn't want applause, Jamal replied. He wanted to listen. Margaret let the silence settle between them. Did he ever talk about me? She asked. Jamal nodded. He said you were strong. That you had to be. He said you grew up behind walls. But he hoped maybe one day you'd tear one down. Her eyes stung. She looked away. How many walls had she built? Back at the mansion, she wandered the halls like a stranger. Her heels echoed across the polished floors, each step a memory she no longer trusted. She stood in the grand living room, where a massive portrait of Thomas hung above the fireplace, painted on their 25th anniversary. His smile in the painting looked formal. Perfect. And now unfamiliar. She sat in his chair and pulled out a box of old journals and notepads. Most were what she expected. Business notes, stock projections, charitable donations categorized by tier. But one notebook, a small black one tucked between legal pads, was different. Inside, scribbled in his unmistakable handwriting. Jamal, bright future, powerful writer. Needs someone to tell him that. Terrence lost his father, gifted with numbers. Mentorship isn't about saving. It's about reminding them they're worth saving. Margaret pressed the book to her chest, holding it like it might shatter. He had written about them. He had seen them. And he had never told her. The next morning, Margaret visited a small flower shop in Jamal's neighborhood. The young florist looked up from trimming stems. I need 2 flowers, she said. Not the most expensive. The most honest. He returned with a wild daisy and a white lily, tied with a soft blue ribbon. Margaret nodded, paid in cash and left. She found Jamal at the cemetery. Same stone bench. Same notebook in his lap. When he saw her approach, he tilted his head curiously. No fancy bouquet today? Margaret smiled gently. Fancy flowers never say what needs to be said. She handed him the daisy. He hesitated. Then took it carefully with both hands like something sacred. Margaret knelt beside the grave and placed the lily beside the wilted wildflowers Jamal had left days ago. I came to say I'm sorry, she said. He did not interrupt. She continued, not just for how I treated you that day, but for every year I chose not to see. For every question I never asked. For every wall I helped keep standing. Jamal looked down, his voice quiet. Sometimes all it takes is one conversation. Margaret turned to him. Would you have tea with me? He blinked. Tea. That's what I have to offer. And questions. I'm ready to listen. He grinned. All right, but only if there's sugar. For the first time in years, Margaret laughed. Not politely. Not out of habit. It was real. The Wilson mansion had never hosted someone like Jamal before. Not a politician. Not a banker. Not a man in a tailored suit or a woman carrying a designer clutch. Jamal walked through the tall wooden doors that afternoon wearing the same hoodie, the same quiet demeanor, and carrying something no guest had ever brought before, honesty. Margaret led him not into the drawing room, not into the formal parlor reserved for press and parties, but into the kitchen. A place she herself had barely used. Usually staff ran it like a clock. But today she boiled water. With her own hands. The china was mismatched. She had never noticed. She had never cared. Jamal sat at the end of the long oak table, his elbows off the surface, his fingers fidgeting with the handle of his mug. She poured the tea. He added 3 spoonfuls of sugar without hesitation. Margaret said nothing. Instead, she placed a plate of lemon cookies in front of him. I hope they're sweet enough, she said softly. I hope they're not, Jamal replied with a small grin. I like to add more. They both laughed. It was a sound not heard in this kitchen for years. A sound that filled the space like music. They talked. Jamal spoke more than she expected. About law school. About kids like him who had no one to believe in them. About writing and what it meant to finally have a voice. Margaret did not interrupt. She did not steer the conversation. She listened. Really listened. And for the first time in her life, she realized how much power there was in simply being quiet. After a long pause, she asked the question that had stayed lodged in her chest since the first moment at the cemetery. Why didn't you come to the funeral? Jamal stirred his tea slowly. His eyes dropped to the cup. I didn't think I belonged. She frowned. Why would you think that? He shrugged lightly. Because it was all suits. All people who saw him as a donor, a name on a plaque. I saw him as something else. A father figure. I didn't think that would matter to anyone in that room. Margaret's throat tightened. It would have, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It would have mattered to me. I just didn't know it yet. He looked up at her then, not with blame, not with pity, but with something closer to grace. Later that evening, as sunlight slipped behind the curtains, Margaret stood and walked over to a tall bookshelf near the fireplace. From the second shelf, she pulled a slim leather folder. She placed it gently on the table in front of Jamal. He looked at it cautiously, then back at her. "These are the founding documents," she said, "for a scholarship and mentorship program I'm starting. I want to call it Project 3B, after the room where it all began." Jamal's fingers hovered above the folder. "I want it to help boys like you," she continued, "to find people who will see them, listen to them, and walk beside them the way Thomas did." He opened the folder slowly. His eyes scanned the pages. Legal terms. Financial backing. Vision statements. His name. "I want you," she said, "to be the first recipient. And if you're willing, its first mentor." Jamal blinked hard, emotion rising quickly in his face. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say yes," Margaret replied gently. "And then say it to 10 more. 100 more. Help others see what Thomas saw in you." Jamal closed the folder and looked at her with eyes shimmering with tears he did not want to fall. "You're not replacing him, Jamal," Margaret added, placing her hand lightly on his. "You're continuing him. In a way even I never could." That night the house was quiet again. But it was no longer empty. Something had shifted. It was no longer a museum of legacy and silence. It had become a space of purpose, of laughter, of possibility. And for the first time, Margaret lit a candle not out of grief but gratitude. She walked into her private study, a room even Thomas never spent much time in, and opened a drawer. Inside, her old journal. The one she had kept when they were newly married. Back when she still asked questions. Before silence became comfort. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. "I do not know if you kept secrets or if I just stopped asking the right questions. Maybe I chose comfort over curiosity. Maybe I saw you but I didn't truly see you. And I think that hurt you more than I ever realized." She paused, then continued. "I met Jamal. I see him now. And I see you in him. I am not going to look away again." The next week, Margaret returned to Brookview. But this time she did not come to search for answers. She came to build something. The youth center was buzzing with weekend activity, kids running down hallways, volunteers handing out notebooks, chalk drawings on the sidewalks outside. Margaret stood near the entrance and watched, unnoticed. This was the life her husband had quietly poured his heart into. And now she would carry it forward. In the back garden, where the weeds had been cleared and fresh soil laid, a small group gathered around a circular patch marked with wooden stakes. Jamal knelt in the center, planting the first flower. A daisy. Margaret walked over, her heels replaced by soft-soled shoes. She held a small pot of lilies in her hand. "For him?" she asked. Jamal nodded. "For both of you." She knelt beside him and helped dig the space. No gloves. No ceremony. Just earth. And memory. A month later, the first cohort of Project 3B gathered in room 3B. 12 boys. Each holding a new journal with their names embossed on the cover. Jamal stood at the front of the room, nervous but proud. He looked to the side, where Margaret stood just outside the doorway watching. He cleared his throat. "Write like the world is listening," he said. "Because someday it will be." Weeks turned to months. The mansion changed. Not on the outside, it still looked regal and grand. But within its walls, things began to grow. The dining room table, once used only for fundraisers and formality, now held pizza boxes and math workbooks. The library, once stiff and silent, now had a corner filled with bean bags and poetry books. Laughter returned. So did meaning. One morning, as spring painted the trees with pink blossoms, Margaret returned to the cemetery. She carried 2 bouquets. One of sunflowers, vibrant and proud. The other, a handful of wild daisies, freshly picked from the youth center's new garden. Jamal waited at the grave, a small smile tugging at his lips as he saw her approach. "Bro?" he asked playfully. "For both of us," she replied, offering him the daisies. He accepted them with care. They knelt together. She placed the sunflowers beside Thomas's name. He placed the daisies beside them. Then Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, a gold pen. The one Thomas had used to sign every business deal, every agreement that shaped the life they once lived. She held it out. "He used this for everything that built our world," she said. "Now it's yours for what comes next." Jamal took it, his fingers wrapping around it with reverence. "I'm not him," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. "I know," she replied. That's why you're going to change even more lives than he did. The wind moved gently through the cemetery trees. It rustled the petals of the sunflowers. It played with the ribbon tied around the daisies. But between Margaret and Jamal, there was stillness, a kind of sacred quiet that no breeze could break. She looked up at the sky, soft and streaked with blue. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me who you really were." Jamal reached out and held her hand. No words followed. None were needed. In that still moment, two generations, two people from opposite sides of the world, stood on the same ground. Love had not died with Thomas. It had simply changed hands. Days passed, then weeks, and Project 3B grew roots. It began as an idea on paper, then became a program with real names, real stories, real voices. The walls of Room 3B transformed into a living mural. More essays, more quotes, more photos. Jamal became its quiet center. Not loud, not flashy, just constant. He mentored with patience. He tutored with care. He listened the way Thomas had listened, fully, humbly, without looking at the clock. Margaret visited often, but never to supervise. She no longer needed to control. She came to learn, to witness, to help serve the lemonade on poetry night, to hand out clean notebooks on Mondays, to kneel beside new parents who had lost their way and assure them someone now stood beside their sons. One afternoon, months after the cemetery morning that changed everything, Margaret found herself once again in the mansion's quiet library. The light from the tall windows fell across the marble floor like a painting. She walked to the grand piano, untouched for years, and lifted the lid. She had never played. Thomas did. But today she sat. And she pressed a key. A single note. Then another. She did not care about playing it right. She just wanted to hear something real. She began writing again too. Not for newspapers or donors or legacy books. But for herself. She filled pages in her old journal. Some about Thomas. Some about Jamal. Many about herself. The woman she used to be, the one who had memorized champagne brands and mastered small talk, was fading like an old photograph. In her place was someone quieter. And far more alive. At the youth center, a small boy named Isaiah began writing haikus. He wrote one for Jamal that made him laugh. He wrote one for Margaret that made her cry. He wrote one for Thomas, even though he had never met him. He gave Jamal hope. So now Jamal gives us light. I call that power. Margaret framed it and placed it at the front of Room 3B. Underneath the haiku, a brass plate was fixed into the wall. Read. Legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we pass forward. Months later, on the first anniversary of Project 3B, a quiet ceremony was held in the community library. No ribbon cutting. No press. Just students. Mentors. Margaret. Jamal. And a few parents who clutched tissues they did not pretend to hide. Margaret stood in front of the crowd, hands folded gently, not over-rehearsed, not scripted. I used to think legacy meant building something big, she said. A mansion. A name. A fund that lasts long after we're gone. She paused, her voice steady. But I have learned something far more important. Legacy is not the size of what you build. It is the depth of who you touch. She looked at Jamal, then at the row of boys in the front row holding journals with their names embossed in gold. Thomas touched lives I never saw, she continued. But now I see them. And I will not stop looking. Silence filled the room. But it was the kind of silence that made hearts full, not heavy. Then Jamal stood. And for the first time in front of others he read aloud. A letter. To Thomas. You were not loud. You didn't hug. You didn't explain much. But you showed up. You waited for me to ask questions instead of flooding me with advice. And when I spoke you really heard me. You made me feel seen without making me feel small. You didn't save me. You reminded me I was already worth saving. And now I remind others. Because of you. By the end, more than a few tears had been wiped away. Not out of grief, but reverence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the buildings, Margaret walked down the narrow path behind the youth center. The garden, once a dry, weeded patch, now bloomed with daisies, lilies, and sunflowers. She reached the farthest row, where a wooden bench had been placed. Beside it, a small plaque. Red's Garden. She smiled at the name. Red. That was what Thomas told the boys to call him. A name far removed from wealth or titles. A name that made him theirs. She sat, watching the flowers sway in the breeze. Jamal soon joined her, a folder in hand. What's this? She asked. He handed it to her. College acceptance letter, he said with a smile. Full scholarship. Law and public policy. Margaret took the letter gently. Her eyes scanned it, then filled with tears. "I wish he could see this," she whispered. "He does," Jamal replied. They sat in silence again like they had months ago. But this silence was different. It was full, warm, alive. Weeks later, before Jamal left for college, Margaret invited him back to the mansion one last time. There was no tea, no cookies, just a quiet walk through the library. She stopped in front of Thomas's portrait and stared, then turned to Jamal. "Would you like to paint your own version?" He blinked. "Of him?" "No," she said. "Of you. For the hallway. 4 room 3B. I want those boys to know they are part of this legacy now. Not just visitors in someone else's mansion." Jamal nodded, emotion rising in his throat. She handed him the gold pen again. "Use this for what comes next," she said. "Not to sign contracts but to write truths." He held it gently. "I will." As he stepped out into the Savannah sun, suitcase in one hand, journal in the other, Margaret stood on the steps. She watched him go with a peace she never knew she was missing. Not just peace in his future, but peace in her past. She had loved Thomas. That had never been in question. But now she understood him. Now she joined the part of his world he had once kept quiet. Not because he distrusted her, but because he knew the journey had to be her own. She had arrived. And now others would too. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal once more. "Love does not end when someone dies. It continues in the hands of those they lifted, the hearts they inspired, the silence they broke, and the seeds they planted." She closed the book, turned out the light, and let the night be soft.